To look upon the modern landscape of the human mind is to witness an intricate, shimmering tapestry woven from a billion identical threads, a vast and invisible architecture that structures not only what we see, but how we permit ourselves to feel, think, and exist. We are born into an inheritance of pre-packaged meanings, a collective psychic gravity that pulls our wildest, most eccentric impulses into neat, predictable orbits. This is the collective mental trap, an ancient, self-replicating labyrinth of the mind that functions so perfectly precisely because its walls are made of our own unexamined agreements, shared anxieties, and borrowed desires. It operates much like a cosmic mirage, a consensus reality so dense and persuasive that it easily passes itself off as nature itself. We mistake the boundaries of our cultural conditioning for the horizons of the universe, unaware that the ceiling we look up to is merely the floor of a deeper, forgotten prison. To understand this trap is to begin a journey that is both deeply practical and cosmic in scale, a process of unweaving the artificial self to discover the raw, unmapped terrain of authentic consciousness that lies beneath. Imagine a vast subterranean ocean where every drop of water believes it is an isolated entity, yet every wave is dictated by a distant mechanical tide. This is the state of the sleepwalking collective, an assembly of individuals who navigate their lives using maps drawn by dead cartographers, chasing symbols of success, security, and identity that have been manufactured in mass production. And we spend our youth learning the vocabulary of this trap, mastering its codes of validation, internalizing its fears of the outsider, the failure, and the void. By the time we reach maturity, the cage has been internalized. We become our own wardens, policing our thoughts before they can even disrupt the smooth surface of our socially sanctioned personas. The tragedy of this condition is not that we suffer, for suffering is an inherent part of the human tapestry, but that we suffer for reasons that do not belong to us. We inherit debts of guilt, obligations of ambition, and scripts of despair that were written centuries before our birth, playing our parts with a desperate, frantic intensity, terrified of what might happen if the music stops and the stage lights go dark. Yet, there is a quiet, persistent ache that haunts the edges of this consensus reality, a subtle dissonance that whispers to us in the spaces between our frantic activities. It manifests as a sudden, inexplicable boredom in the midst of luxury, an acute loneliness in a crowded room, or a flash of profound wonder when we glimpse the indifferent majesty of the natural world. This ache is not a pathology to be cured by more consumption or better integration into the social machine. It is the compass of the soul, a faint, rhythmic signaling from the deeper layers of reality that have not yet been paved over by the collective ego. It is the realization that the world we have built, with all its glittering metrics, ideological battles, and digital echoes, is a hall of mirrors reflecting nothing but our own collective insecurity. And to awaken to this dissonance is to stand at the threshold of the first great sorting, where the comfort of the familiar illusion begins to pale in comparison to the terrifying beauty of the truth. The architecture of the collective mental trap is built upon the manipulation of our deepest evolutionary need, which is the hunger for belonging and the terror of exile. In the primordial dawn of our species, to be cast out from the tribe was a literal death sentence, an abandonment to the cold fangs of the wilderness. The collective mind capitalizes on this ancient trauma, transforming the necessary tribal cohesion of the past into a sophisticated system of psychological conscription. It demands not just cooperation, but but total conceptual alignment. It asks us to surrender our immediate direct perception of reality in exchange for the safety of the group's shared definitions. And we learn to see the forest not as a living, breathing mystery of wood and shadow, but as a resource to be calculated or a background for our social narratives. We learn to see our fellow humans not as miracles of unique consciousness, but as avatars of political, economic, or cultural categories. In doing so, we exchange the vivid, multi-dimensional truth of existence for a flat, black and white caricature, trading our birthright of infinite possibility for a small, secure foxhole in the war of identities. To escape this trap is not an act of violent rebellion against the external world, nor is it a retreat into selfish isolation or cynical nihilism. True escape is a radical, quiet revolution of attention, a systematic reclamation of the sovereign space that exists within each human heart. And it requires us to become archaeologists of our own minds, carefully brushing away the dust of public opinion, ancestral trauma, and media conditioning to uncover the pristine, luminous awareness that precedes all definitions. This journey demands a peculiar kind of courage, one that is distinct from the heroism of the battlefield. It is the courage to be empty, to stand before the vastness of existence without the armor of labels, beliefs, or justifications. It is the willingness to look into the mirror and ask, with absolute sincerity, who is the one looking, when all the stories about who I am are stripped away. This inquiry is the crack in the cosmic mirror, the tiny fracture through which the light of a grander, freer reality begins to pour, revealing that the cage was never locked and the key has always been the very awareness we used to build it. As we stand on the precipice of this deeper investigation, we must realize that the stakes are higher than our personal peace of mind. The collective mental trap is not an abstract philosophical puzzle. It is the engine driving our global crises, our ecological collective blindness, and our perpetual cycles of conflict. When millions of minds are trapped in the same unexamined loops of scarcity, fear, and division, the external world inevitably becomes a physical manifestation of that internal chaos. Therefore, the act of escaping this mental confinement is the most profoundly generous and radical contribution an individual can make to the world. It is an invitation to step off the wheel of reaction, to become a point of stillness in a turning world, and to anchor a different kind of presence on this earth. It is an adventure that leads us through the dark, winding corridors of our shared illusions, out into the blinding, breathtaking expanse of a reality that is waiting to be known, tasted, and lived in its pure, unmediated glory. To dismantle the intricate scaffolding of the collective mental trap, we must first learn to perceive its core pillars, the silent foundational laws that govern its quiet dominion over the human psyche. The first and most pervasive of these pillars is the illusion of linear fragmentation, the deeply ingrained belief that reality is composed of separate, isolated parts moving through a mechanical, sterile timeline. The collective mind thrives on this division, carving the continuous, breathing wholeness of existence into neat conceptual boxes, separating the self from the other, the mind from the body, and humanity from the living earth. This artificial splintering creates an ambient, perpetual state of existential homelessness, leaving us to drift through life like severed leaves, wondering why we feel withered and cold. When we accept this fragmentation as truth, we become easily manipulated consumers of external completions, seeking to heal our inner division through accumulated objects, social status, or rigid ideological allegiances that promise a false sense of wholeness but only deepen our alienation. Beneath this fragmentation lies the second pillar, which is the tyrannical reign of the conceptual surrogate, a process by which the living, unnameable texture of direct experience is completely replaced by linguistic labels and mental abstractions. We no longer look at the sky to feel its silent, overwhelming vastness. Instead, we categorize the weather, check our devices for reports on atmospheric conditions, and quickly file the moment away under the category of a pleasant or unpleasant day. The collective trap replaces the vibrant, unpredictable kaleidoscope of the present moment with a dead museum of concepts, demanding that we relate to our ideas about life rather than to life itself. This creates a subtle but profound emotional starvation, for the mind cannot be truly nourished by descriptions, any more than a starving person can be fed by reading a beautifully written menu. By living through these conceptual surrogates, we become insulated from both the raw grief and the ecstatic joy of existence, inhabiting a sterile, padded cell of interpretations where nothing can truly touch us, wound us, or wake us up. The third pillar supporting the architecture of our shared confinement is the addiction to external validation, a psychological gravity that anchors the seat of our personal identity outside of our own sovereign awareness. From the earliest days of childhood, the collective matrix trains us to look to the eyes of others for permission to exist, transforming our innate, radiant worth into a volatile currency that rises and falls with public opinion, cultural trends, and social media metrics. This externalization of the self creates a frantic, performance-based existence, a perpetual masquerade where we continuously shapeshift to appease a fickle and indifferent audience. We become actors who have forgotten that we are wearing costumes, desperately terrified of the moment when the applause fades and we are left alone with the silent, unadorned presence of our own being. This addiction systematically hollows out our inner authority, ensuring that we remain dependent on the very systems that constrain us, terrified to step out of the collective line lest we become invisible to the eyes that define us. Compounding this external performance is the fourth pillar, the phantom of manufactured scarcity, an omnipresent cultural myth that whispers that there is never enough time, never enough love, never enough security, and ultimately, never enough of who we are. The collective mind operates as a perpetual motion machine fueled by this synthetic lack, driving us into a state of frantic, aggressive competition with our fellow travelers. We are taught to view life as a finite pie, where another person's joy, success, or awakening somehow diminishes our own chances of survival or happiness. This deep-seated panic blinds us to the self-evident abundance of the universe, a reality where life constantly pours itself forth in endless, redundant creativity without ever asking for a return on its investment. And by internalizing this myth of scarcity, we lock ourselves into an evolutionary bottleneck of predatory self-interest, hoarding resources and defensive postures, completely unable to see that the treasury we are searching for is the very capacity for open-hearted awareness that we are sacrificing in the chase. Finally, the entire structure of the collective trap is locked into place by the fifth pillar, which is the hypnotic cycle of reactive momentum, a pattern of living where our actions are merely automatic, conditioned reflexes to external stimuli. In this state of psychological somnambulism, we do not choose our thoughts, our angers, or our desires. Rather, they happen to us, triggered by the calculated algorithms of media platforms, ancestral habits, and the emotional currents of the crowds around us. We become like leaves caught in a chaotic windstorm, mistaking our rapid motion for purposeful flight, entirely unaware of the silent, unmoving space of consciousness that lies within us, capable of choosing its own orientation. This reactive momentum robs us of our fundamental human dignity, reducing our vast, multidimensional intelligence to a series of predictable mechanical circuits that can be easily triggered by those who understand the levers of fear and pride. To break this momentum is to discover the fertile void that exists between a stimulus and our response, a microscopic interval of pure potential where our true freedom awaits. To see these pillars clearly is not to plunge into a state of despair or bitter cynicism, but rather to experience the initial, exhilarating rush of true clarity. Yet the collective mental trap is not a solid, unbreakable fortress built of stone and iron. It is a complex, self-sustaining illusion that requires our daily, active participation and unexamined belief to maintain its form. The moment we begin to withdraw our attention from these false pillars, the moment we choose wholeness over fragmentation, direct experience over labels, inner authority over external applause, abundance over scarcity, and conscious response over mechanical reaction, the walls of the labyrinth begin to thin and lose their solidity. We realize that the trap has no power of its own. It is fueled entirely by our own borrowed light, a grand diversion that dissolves the moment we dare to turn our gaze inward, anchoring ourselves in the undeniable, luminous truth of our own immediate, sovereign presence. To truly comprehend the subtle alchemy required to dissolve the collective mental trap, we must journey beyond the sterile territory of literal description and enter the timeless theater of myth and allegory. Throughout the long, shadowed history of human consciousness, the wisest guides have understood that the deepest truths cannot be captured in the rigid cages of literal speech. They must be courted through symbols that bypass the defensive gatekeepers of our rational conditioning. Imagine, then, a grand ancient metropolis known as the City of Mirrors, a place built entirely within a vast subterranean cavern where the inhabitants have forgotten the existence of the sun, the stars, and the open sky. In this city, every wall, every street, and every ceiling is constructed from polished, distorted glass, reflecting an infinite, bewildering labyrinth of images. And the citizens spend their entire lives studying these reflections, competing fiercely for the most flattering angles and mistaking the flat, shifting glimmers on the walls for the substance of their own souls, entirely unaware that they are chasing ghosts in a house of illusions. Within the City of Mirrors, a complex priesthood arises, dedicated to the cataloging and preservation of the reflections. They teach the young that the images on the glass are the only reality that has ever existed or could ever exist, creating elaborate sciences to predict how a reflection will warp when a person moves, and establishing strict moral codes based on maintaining a pleasing presentation in the mirrors of one's neighbors. If a citizen begins to feel a strange, hollow ache in their chest, a longing for something that cannot be seen on the polished surfaces, they are told that their reflection is simply malformed, and they are prescribed new garments, new titles, or more intense rituals of self-beautification to correct the image. To suggest that there is a world outside the cavern, or that the inhabitants are something other than the flat shapes moving across the glass, is considered the highest form of madness, a dangerous heresy that threatens to shatter the fragile social cohesion that keeps the city from plunging into the dark panic of the unknown. Well, among these citizens, however, there occasionally arises an eccentric individual who, through some fortunate accident or unbearable sorrow, ceases to look at the reflections and instead places their hand directly against the cold, smooth surface of the glass itself. In that moment of tactile contact, a profound shock ripples through their entire being. They realize that the mirror is not a window into an infinite world, but a hard, impenetrable barrier that prevents them from touching anything real. This is the moment of initial awakening, the realization that the entire social landscape they have navigated with such frantic seriousness is an insubstantial projection, a grand, collective dream sustained only by their refusal to touch the wall. Boy. As they push harder against the glass, they detect a faint, rhythmic vibration emanating from the deep stone behind it, a primordial heartbeat that has been drumming patiently since before the city was built. They realize that to find the true source of this heartbeat, they must do the unthinkable. They must stop trying to fix, improve, or defend their reflection, and instead prepare to shatter the very glass that defines their existence. A similar truth is whispered in the ancient allegory of the Weaver of Shadows, a mythical being who dwells at the center of a great celestial loom, spinning a fabric made entirely of human words, labels, and definitions. When a new soul descends into the world, the weaver gently drapes this luminous, intricate veil over their eyes, telling them that this is the garment of safety, the map that will guide them through the chaotic wilderness of life. At first, the veil seems like a wondrous gift, for it labels the terrifying shadows as trees, the overwhelming torrents as rivers, and the unpredictable strangers as kin or foe, transforming the wild, ecstatic chaos of raw existence into a predictable, manageable landscape. The soul learns to navigate by the patterns woven into the cloth, feeling a sense of mastery as they match the labels on their eyes with the objects they encounter in the world, believing that they are truly understanding the mystery of creation. However, as the years pass, the veil begins to thicken, absorbing the anxieties, prejudices, and historical grievances of all the souls who have worn it before. The threads, which were once light and transparent, become heavy, opaque, and saturated with the dark dyes of fear and separation. The soul begins to notice that they can no longer see the true, radiant colors of the world. Everything is viewed through the dull, monotonous tint of the collective weaving. When they look at a flower, they no longer see a unique, unrepeatable explosion of life. They see only the word flower, a cold, generic category that strips the moment of its wonder. The veil, which was intended to be a tool for navigation, has become an insufferable blindfold, insulating the individual from the direct, transformative current of reality, leaving them to live in a world of ghosts, reacting not to what is actually there, but to the ancient dusty patterns woven into the fabric before their eyes. And the escape from this weaver's loom begins not by trying to tear the veil with force, for the fabric is woven from our own thoughts, and every struggle only tightens its grip, but through the cultivation of a quiet, unblinking stillness. When the soul sits perfectly quiet, refusing to label the arising sensations, refusing to name the grief, the joy, the sound of the wind, or the beating of the heart, the threads of the veil begin to lose their tension. In that profound silence, the individual discovers that they are not the patterns woven into the cloth, nor are they the eyes that are trapped behind it. They are the very space of awareness in which the veil arises and dissolves. With this realization, the ancient garment simply unravels, falling away like a spider's web in a sudden gale, exposing the individual to the blinding, breathtaking majesty of an unmediated reality, a world where every breath is a direct communion with the nameless infinite, and the long, dark dream of separation is instantly revealed, to have been nothing but a trick of the light. To bridge the chasm between the exalted heights of symbolic awakening and the gritty, concrete realities of daily existence, we must learn to apply these insights where they matter most, in the ordinary, unglamorous moments that make up the fabric of our lives. The collective mental trap does not just exist in abstract philosophical domains. It operates in the way we respond to an irritating email, the manner in which we consume news, the internal narratives we construct while standing in a supermarket line, and the subtle power dynamics of our closest relationships. The first step in grounding this liberation is the practice of somatic anchoring, which means intentionally shifting our seat of awareness out of the chaotic, analytical mind and down into the living, breathing laboratory of the physical body. When the collective mind attempts to pull us into a vortex of panic, outrage, or scarcity, the body remains an oasis of absolute presence, experiencing only the true now, free from the projections of past grievances or future anxieties. By developing an acute, moment-to-moment sensitivity to our physical sensations, we establish an early warning system against collective conscription. When we feel the sudden tightening of the chest, the shallowing of the breath, or the defensive hardening of the jaw that accompanies a wave of social media outrage or cultural panic, we can recognize these symptoms not as our own authentic feelings, but as the activation of the collective trap's mechanical circuits within our biology. Instead of reacting to the external trigger, we can choose to pause, to breathe deeply into the belly, and to simply witness the physical energy as it moves through us, refusing to feed it with additional thoughts or justifications. This simple, radical act of staying present with our discomfort breaks the chain of reactive momentum, allowing us to meet the world not as a conditioned machine, but as a centered, sovereign presence capable of introducing a completely different quality of energy into the situation. This somatic grounding naturally transforms our relationship with the vast predatory landscape of modern information and technology. The collective trap in the contemporary era is largely digital, operating through sophisticated algorithms designed to exploit our ancient evolutionary vulnerabilities, keeping our attention perpetually fragmented, defensive, and addicted to novelty. To integrate our freedom into this environment requires the implementation of strict, conscious boundaries around our attention, a practice we might call informational fasting. This does not mean retreating into an ignorant Luddite isolation, but rather choosing to become an active curator of our mental input rather than a passive target for corporate algorithms. It involves setting aside specific times of the day to completely disconnect from all screens, intentionally seeking out long stretches of silence, and choosing to engage with deep, slow, and complex ideas rather than the shallow, hyper-stimulating sound bites that fuel the collective firestorm of division. As our attention becomes more stable and less reactive, we begin to perceive a profound shift in the way we communicate with others, moving away from the transactional, performance-based dialogues of the collective trap toward a state of radical, open-hearted listening. In the ordinary matrix of society, conversations are rarely true meetings of souls. They are more often competitive matches where two egos wait for their turn to speak, using the other person's words merely as stepping stones to project their own opinions, validations, or identities. To break this pattern is to practice a form of listening that is entirely empty of the self, a state of presence where we lay down our need to agree, disagree, judge, or fix, and instead offer the other person the rarest and most precious commodity in the modern world, our undivided, uncritical attention. In this quality of listening, we look past the external labels, political affiliations, and defensive armor of the person standing before us, communicating directly with the vulnerable, searching consciousness beneath, thereby dissolving the illusion of separation in real time. Furthermore, this internal liberation radically redefines our relationship to work, creativity, and our sense of purpose within the socio-economic machine. And the collective trap teaches us to view our labor through the lens of manufactured scarcity, driving us to climb hierarchical ladders, hoard symbols of status, and measure our worth by our productivity or financial utility. When we step off this wheel, we discover that true work is not a means to an external end, but a natural, joyous overflowing of our unique, creative intelligence into the world. We begin to choose our vocations and daily tasks not based on what will bring us the most external applause or security, but based on what aligns most deeply with our intrinsic values and brings the greatest degree of harmony to our immediate environment. A work ceases to be a stressful burden endured for the sake of survival and becomes a form of living art, a venue where we practice absolute presence, excellence, and service, transforming even the most mundane tasks into expressions of sacred stewardship. Finally, the practical integration of this freedom manifests as a profound, unshakable resilience in the face of life's inevitable uncertainties and losses. When our identity is no longer anchored in the shifting sands of collective validation, cultural trends, or external conditions, we are no longer devastated when those structures experience their natural cycles of decay and collapse. We stand in the world like a deeply rooted tree during a fierce storm. Though our branches may sway and our leaves may be stripped away by the winds of change, our central trunk remains unmoving, anchored in the bedrock of a timeless, unconditioned awareness. We become capable of meeting grief, illness, and failure, not as existential catastrophes that destroy our worth, but as profound initiatory thresholds that strip away our remaining illusions, revealing the indestructible diamonds of compassion, wisdom, and strength that have always lived at the core of our being, waiting to be claimed. To stand at the final shoreline of this extensive inquiry is to realize that the journey out of the collective mental trap is not a destination we reach in some distant, idealized future, but a radical, immediate pivot of consciousness that can only take place in the absolute simplicity of the present moment. We have traveled through the invisible architecture of our shared confinement, unmasked the false pillars of fragmentation, conceptual surrogates, external validation, manufactured scarcity, and reactive momentum, and we have listened to the ancient myths that remind us of our true, unblindfolded nature. Now, the grand descriptions must fall away, the philosophical scaffolding must be dismantled, and we must confront the silent, glowing core of the matter itself. But the collective trap, for all its immense global scale and historic weight, possesses no independent life of its own. It is a ghost that we bring to life in every moment that we choose the comfort of a familiar lie over the raw, untamed reality of our own immediate experience. The path forward does not ask you to change the world, to reform the institutions, or to engage in ideological battles with those who are still soundly asleep within the city of mirrors, or to fight the illusion using the tools of division is simply another way of ensuring its perpetual survival. The call is far more intimate, far more terrifying, and infinitely more powerful. It is the call to step entirely off the wheel of consensus validation and to claim your birthright as a sovereign focus of the universe's awakening intelligence. It requires you to inhabit your life with an uncompromising, luminous honesty, to look directly at your fears, your longings, and your societal conditioning without judgment, and to realize that the one who witnesses these patterns is already completely free from their grip. You are not the mask that has been fashioned for you by ancestral trauma and cultural demand. You are the vast, silent space of awareness in which the mask is continuously created, sustained, and dissolved. This transformation is not a path of accumulation where you acquire new spiritual titles, more sophisticated beliefs, or better concepts to replace the old ones. It is a profound, holy process of subtraction, a systematic unlearning of everything that stands between your awareness and the naked majesty of existence. It is the willingness to be nobody in a world that is desperately obsessed with being somebody, to find absolute contentment in the simple rhythm of a single breath, and to anchor a quality of stillness that can look upon the chaos of the shifting times with eyes of deep, unconditional compassion. When an individual achieves this quiet inner liberation, a subtle but irreversible fracture occurs in the collective matrix. A point of pure, unmediated reality is established on the earth, acting as a silent, magnetic beacon that makes it just a little easier for every other searching soul to find their own way out of the darkness. And the universe is not a collection of dead mechanical objects moving through a cold void, nor is human history a meaningless sequence of conflicts and consumption. Creation is a living, breathing mystery that is actively seeking to know and express its own infinite depth through the lens of your unique human consciousness. Every time you choose to truly see a tree instead of merely labeling it, every time you meet another person's pain with an open, defenseless heart, and every time you choose a conscious, loving response over a mechanical, reactive reflex, you are participating in the cosmic awakening of the whole. The cage has always been open. The wardens were only ever the shadows of your own unexamined fears. And the world outside the cavern is waiting, bathed in the timeless, brilliant light of a reality that has never forgotten who you truly are. Step forward into the open air, breathe deeply of the infinite, and dare to live as a free, unconditioned embodiment of the living truth.